I'd like to call this General Plan Advisory Committee to order. And will, Mr. Rothschild, would you lead us into the Pledge of Allegiance?
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight, the staff, the audience, and those viewers who are watching us from home. And before we begin, will you go ahead and, Jessica, take the roll call?
And then Ruben? Present. Angela? Present. Edward? Present. Amelia?
Present.
Richard?
Here.
Rafi?
Present.
I apologize if I didn't say that right. And then Joel. Good, okay.
I'm present.
All right.
A 3-minute limitation shall apply to each member of the public who wishes to address the General Plan Advisory Committee on any item on the agenda, excluding public hearings. Is there anyone tonight who would like to make a public comment on an item not on the agenda, or? Okay. We have quite a long agenda, and as all of you had received the notes of the meeting, we're going to be discussing and reviewing quite a bit. And with that, I'd like to introduce Woody Tetcher, and he's going to lead us in the discussion.
And maybe, I think you know Dave and Travis by this point in time. I'll just, to speed things on, introduce them for you, if you will. We do have a long agenda. This is the first of a number of meetings that we will be having, which will be the bulk of the remaining meetings, focusing on the goals, policies, and implementation measures of the various general plan elements themselves. We are, just to remind everybody, starting with the existing general plan elements as our base. We're finding that some of them are requiring, especially those that you're considering tonight, extensive revisions because of changes of state law and because of some of the coverages. So, for example, safety, you're not going to recognize the safety element because the safety element, due to all the legislation pertaining to climate change and the new requirements for risk vulnerability assessments, et cetera, those were not on the table the last time the general plan was prepared. So there's a lot of new information. The energy water conservation sections probably have had less changes, but there are some fairly significant because, again, for climate change, because of water conservation strategies and energy conservation strategies coming out. So, and I also will upfront apologize. We've probably given you 2 versions of the documents. One, we cleaned up there were some typos in it, and also some of the policies were non-numbered, so we had to go back and redo it as well. Content, there was no change at all to the other basic written material, so all the policies are still there. So anything you have a question on a policy that we're going to talk about tonight as well. Before I get started, just briefly, I want to just remind ourselves, this is our agenda for tonight. This is the schedule of the upcoming meetings after tonight. And you will see that in 2 weeks, again, we'll be meeting, and then we'll have a little bit longer break to be focusing on economic development, a topic of considerable interest. And we're going to have a talking session about environmental justice. You won't be seeing the actual goals and policies that we want to have an engaged dialogue with you about some of the perceptions that you and anyone who is here from the community at large feels are significant issues to be addressed in that particular element. The person who's working on the EJ element is Mark Hoffman, who you met here with the housing element on several of his meetings, and he's leading that particular effort as well. And then you can see the schedule also has not been changed for the remaining meetings after that. The other introductory comment I want to make is we have, since we last met, we took the general plan map that you had worked on and we reviewed a few weeks ago, and it's now online, and we encourage you to ask your friends, neighbors, or anyone you just walk on the street to basically go to the project website and take a look at it. And I just took a couple of screenshots here because I think there are a couple of things to point out. It's a very interactive map, you'll see. So as you go to, is the first image up here is on the first page, the home page of the project website. And you will see up there that there's this gray box that pops up when you scroll down from the top of the screen that brings up to this particular message about that the plan map is now online, what's new. And then you will see that where I have the red arrow up on the screen, there is a tab to click. If you click on that particular map, or that particular tab, what you'll do is then find the overall information about the draft land use map. It says it's available for review, comment, etc. And then if you scroll down a little bit further on the screen, you will see that there is the map there, it's citywide, etc. You will see where the red arrow is here, that there is a then linkage to all the description of the various land use categories that we've been working on previously. So if somebody is looking at, let's say, the category for mixed use, whatever, they can click on that and they'll be able to see and understand what the permitted uses are and the densities, intensities associated with that as well. And then the other nice thing about this map is on the upper left, well, go back. Okay, I reordered the slides a little bit. There is, you can zoom in on the map. You'll see up here on the slide where the left arrow is, there's a plus minus. You click on either the plus or minus. The plus, of course, zooms you in to greater detail. The minus pulls you back out. So you can also then click, as you will see on the right-hand side of the screen, with a specific parcel, a specific block of land or parcel, and you will see a little box. Projection in this room doesn't really help very much. Where you'll see, what you will see on clicking, popping up is a pop-up box, which basically is a clear indication of what the use is that is recommended on the site. So it's not just the color code that you've been looking at, which is also referenced, but also you'll be able to click on any particular parcel on the city, anywhere in the city, to look at what the land use recommendation is. And then if you want clarification, you go back to that other chart that I mentioned here, the one that has the description of the land use categories. There are also then, if you scroll down below that map, once you've done that, there is a place for public comments. So you can identify saying, well, I'm interested in the corner of Arrowhead and some other street, or some location, particularly on the map. You can, on the first arrow there, enter the address of where you have some interest, and then you can enter in the information regarding what your comment is about that. So for instance, you can say, I prefer, housing on that site versus commercial, or whatever it is. You have the opportunity to comment. And then just to let you know, we'll be keeping this alive until middle to late May. And what we'll be doing is then taking all the comments that we receive, bringing those back to you for the meeting later this year that's on the schedule, to bring the land use plan map to you that you have been working on, and you will have the opportunity to distill those comments, et cetera, relative to any changes that you would want to recommend based upon what you've heard from the public as well. So I just wanted to bring you to this attention since we got it live. I've been joking a couple times with these folks. They noticed that we had some color coding issues initially. For example, the airport area was designated yellow, which is residential, not thinking that the airport was probably not really intending to convert the airport into housing, but, maybe some people out there would have liked that whatsoever. But anyway, point being is all those corrections have occurred as well. So I wanted to bring you up to date on that as well. So this is the first, as I said, in a series of discussions on the various elements themselves. So tonight, as we look at the elements, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes because there's certain nomenclature, goal, policies, and programs that I want to make sure that we all have an understanding of the common definitions for, et cetera. And then we'll get into a presentation on each of the three elements under consideration: energy, water conservation, historic, archaeological, and safety themselves. We will take each one separately. I will give you an overview of those. I will review the goals overview. And very quickly, I'm not going to read 222 policies for you tonight or expect you to basically dive in. Hopefully, you've had a chance to take a look at that. But we're looking for the basic sense of whether this is apparently a reflection of San Bernardino's direction. A lot of this is going to be basically grounded by legislation, especially on at least two of those topics, and basically get your feedback on those if you have a question, and also if you see something missing, say, I don't see flooding addressed. It isn't here, but that's a hypothetical question that you could by the presentation. So we're looking for, as you'll see here on the bottom for each of those, some discussion, any clarifications, any issues you have, or any particular topics. We recognize there's a lot to cover, so we also would like you for the next 2 weeks, if you have any detail, to send any additional comments beyond tonight to me by April 17th. And that way we'll be able to amass those and then have further discussion, et cetera. So tonight, think of it as a sort of a preview, a little bit more than a preview, but to get you into a knowledgeable of the elements themselves. So when we talk about a general plan element, what's in the general plan element? This is sort of a mini table of contents that you will see for each of the elements once you get the full element. We have not submitted to you the full element. We have only submitted to you the goals, policies, and programs. Like housing, the background information, for example, on safety is almost 200 pages long, et cetera. It'll, of course, be available for your review. We did include in that second mailing to you the maps, the figures that are referenced in the document, such as the floodways, the fire hazard zones, the vulnerable access areas, all those maps we did send to you because we think they're important for you to have. But the full narrative text and technical analyses, we didn't. And you wouldn't even be sitting here if you started reading those at this point in time. You'd still be looking at those documents themselves, but they will be available. So the element itself will contain the description of the purpose of the element. There will be a citation of what the legislative requirements are for that element in terms of what should be covered. There will be emphasis, a brief description in the actual element of the existing conditions. We're not going to, in the actual formal element, document and provide all that documentation. So much of it's technical. That will be a technical appendix rather than embodied in. So there'll be a very high level overview at the beginning of each section, and then a basic summary of the key issues that sort of frame the reason that the content has been prepared for goals, policies, and programs. And then there will be the goals, policies, and implementation measures contained within the element. Let me give you four also so we have some common understanding. Sometimes this gets difficult, and when we use certain terminology like goals in different settings and for different purposes, sometimes a goal has different meanings to people. I know that in our business environment, for example, we will have a goal each year when we have our business meetings of talking about how much additional revenue that we're going to be trying to generate during a year, or so many new projects, and all of those are quantified. Well, goals for general plan are not quantified. There's a key distinction in when I describe what a goal is. So the wording that's here is strictly out of the government guidelines relative to content of the general plans. So in reviewing the terminology, just want to make sure you have an understanding what is the, if you will, the basis and the foundation for how they are written themselves. So a goal, as you see up here on the screen under the definition for general plans, is an end state. It's a what happens after, where you are the 20 to 30 years from in the future, et cetera. And it's a general expression of the values. As you see on the screen, bolded the text, it's generally not quantifiable or time dependent. It's telling you that there's something out there today that you want it maybe to be different or the same in the future. So, for example, gave you two examples of an end state: neighborhoods of well-maintained homes, ample public services and facilities, open spaces and infrastructure providing quality places to reside. It doesn't tell you how you're going to get there. It basically is saying this is where 20 to 30 years in the future we would like to be. The second potential goal, an economy that is resilient to maintain market changes and evolution, et cetera. So clean streets would be a goal. Affordable housing, those are all goals, worthy goals of a general plan. A safe community, safe from the threat of fires and floods and earthquakes and whatever else are reasonable goals. Oops, I'm sorry. Now, the policies are the next level down, and the wording here is that it is a specific statement basically on how you're going to achieve the goal. It is intended, this is really what cities are held accountable to. Cities, if there's any kind of legal review, if there's any kind of challenge into general plans, the general plan policy is really, because the other is such high level, the real policies is where the rubber meets the road in terms of the importance of the wording, et cetera. Because as you see in the language, it represents a commitment of the local legislative body, in this case the mayor, city council, to a particular course of action. And there's some and trust me, there are many general plans that probably don't get this right. There's very important understanding of when the terms are shall versus should. Because if you use the term shall in a policy, that means you cannot accept or provide an exception to that particular direction. It means the city shall do something, et cetera. And remember, parenthetically, any policy will always begin with the words the city, because it's the city's document. So it's not that a policy would begin that the school district will. A policy would be the city shall work with the school district to make something happen. Because it is the city's document, et cetera, and so forth. As you see in the text up there, should is a less rigid directive, and usually you only use that term if there is some, if you will, limitation on your ability to meet the mandate of what the requirement would be. So if you had a policy saying you wanted to allocate money for the planting of street trees in all commercial districts of the city, and some plans will say to city should allocate $100,000 per year for street trees or something like that as well. That's a case where should would be an appropriate word, because you cannot guarantee budgets over a 30-year period of time. It's something that you cannot really make happen as a city. And that's the only time you should I'm using the word should here, that's the only time you can use the word should or emphasize or encourage. Those are not good words for policies unless there is some limitation on your ability to make the policy happen. I've worked with planning commissions and city councils through the years and still struggle with this concept of how these are worded. But just remember that you will see we're trying to pick, as we write these goals or these policies in particular, we're very mindful of that language limitation as well, and that's a standard for et cetera. So as a couple of examples here of policies, implicitly before the word priorities is the city shall prioritize the development of permanent supportive housing and affordable housing at extremely low income levels for residents transitioning out of supportive housing. So you may have had a goal of adequate housing for all segments of the community. And so you would have multiple policies addressing that as well. Or the city shall provide connections to transit stations by identifying roadway, et cetera. I don't need to read it all for you, but you can get a gist of that. This carries out a goal for in terms of access to transit stations and how we get there. The implementation measures then simply are those kind of actions, those tools a city takes to carry out the policy. So, for example, if we had a policy that the city shall provide sufficient land for housing to meet every income level, every age level, whatever else you have in the element, you may have an implementation measure says specifically, well, how does the city do that? Well, you rezone property and you give a time frame for that rezoning as well, by which and you would also identify who is responsible for that. And within the documents you see, we have tables at the end of each of the three elements, which is the first initial pass at identifying what those implementation programs are as well. So you will see an example of that here. As you see, well, on the screen, you will see that there's a table which has a descriptive narrative about what the action is. There is a column then that refers back to what policies that action or measure carries out. There is then a column indicating who is responsible within the city to carry that out. And then there is a column indicating timing. And that will occur throughout all of the general plan elements that you will see as we move forward. Before we move on to the elements, any questions about either the language or the organization that I've just covered? I've covered a lot in those few minutes. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've got quite a few. So I'm trying to go back to when we first started. I thought the implementation plan was something different than the general plan.
The implementation measure is under state law. Every policy shall be accompanied by an implementation measure. Whether you actually have that in the body of the general plan or as a separate document is up for discussion and done differently by different cities. We're still haven't addressed that here yet, but we have to identify the implementation during this process, whether it's in or out. One of the reasons some cities sometimes they bifurcate it because implementation, for example, that are based upon budgeting or based upon what I call certainty, that you know certain things are available or you know certain programs are available, may be carved out as a separate, document for that very reason. Or legislation changes over a period of time, that when you wrote the general plan that legislation may not have been in place and the rules is something to achieve, or funding sources may change, et cetera. If the implementation measures themselves are embedded into the general plan, what we always will do is indicate that a provision that all of those can be changed without an amendment to the general plan. And the reason you want to say that in a general plan is the introduction to the implementation measures is if you amend the general plan, that opens up for CEQA review. Time, cost, all sorts of reasons you don't want to do that. So the actual structure of these implementation measures will be, whether it's embedded in the body or separate document, that's still discussion with city staff on the best utility of making that work as well. But we must, under law, have implementation measures identified.
Okay, and I guess the sort of the next question, and just looking at this, at a very high level, these look like a lot of, very precise, targeted, goals and objectives. What I don't see is sort of themes that tie them together, and it's hard to take this out of context of the rest of the general plan.
Keep going.
I'm sorry, but so the real question is, where in the general plan do we address conflicting priorities? For instance, you say, we want a clean environment, but we also want warehouses, and which, have environmental impacts that are contrary to another part of the section.
You can't. It's illegal. Inconsistency, you must have internal inconsistency in a general plan. So you have got to somehow, if you want warehousing, you need to have policies to address how that meets your other objective for a clean city or whatever it's going to be.
Okay, but I mean, there are things that just are inherently inconsistent.
Can't do that.
But they're here. That's exactly the point. They're in here. They're inconsistent. So if you say I want low-cost housing, but I want it to withstand all these natural disasters and be
right.
Structurally sound to a 10.0 earthquake, that's kind of contrary to affordable housing.
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
No. In fact, it's been very clear in the housing legislation that you need to make both work.
Okay. I guess what I don't see in here is how you do that.
Well, you will see that there, in the final document, that there's been care taken. Well, first, also, I should say that in the introduction, which I did show in the outline, actually, interestingly enough, thanks for bringing it up, in the introduction to each element, there is very clearly a discussion about how that particular element relates to all the other elements of the general plan itself. So there'll be an introductory discussion to that as well.
Okay, I guess another way to phrase this is these are things that are, because I saw this in the last general plan. There's some goals and objectives in there which are wonderful, assuming you've got unlimited budgets, which we never do. So we have to make budget decisions, say we're going to fund this priority and not this priority. To me, the general plan ought to say, these are the priorities, that we're going to put first. These are the, we want to haves. These are the nice to haves, in some sort of an order that says, hey, it help us. I guess I'm looking for a general plan to help us make decisions as we go forward.
Of course.
In other words, so when somebody comes to us and says, I have an idea, you look at it and say, well, it's one of these things in here, it's be nice to have, but, it's below our budget threshold. There's just not enough money to pay for it.
Yeah, well, that's why
And so the general plan ought to give you guidance to say,
yeah, that's why the general plan defers to other planning documents for making those kinds of priority decisions. Like, the general plan does not have and will not have, specific improvements for infrastructure, exactly, to accommodate development. It will not say build an 8-inch pipe or expand your existing water pipes to 12 inches, et
so
cetera.
I understand, but the general plan ought to come out and say, these are the most important things to our community. These other things are nice for us to have, but these are the things that are most important.
Yeah, I think some of that will be addressed in the implementation plan, because in the implementation plan, we'll have the opportunity to identify short, mid-range, and long-term goals, or implementation periods.
Implementation measures, yeah.
Yeah.
But the general plan, to me, it's just the opposite. The general plan ought to drive, what your priorities are.
But again, the policies, you cannot prioritize one over another. That's illegal. That is illegal.
But do policies have to be in the general plan?
I mean, you cannot have internal inconsistency, period. So you need, for example, when we talk about mobility, that mobility plan must provide ability to accommodate all of the uses and the traffic associated with all the uses that are going to be generated by that land use map. There is a requirement for correlation in the law.
I understand, but it goes beyond, to me, it goes beyond the land use map, and I won't drag this on,
Yeah.
because I know we have a lot on the agenda, but, we put in things here like, we want to have a robust arts and entertainment, a culturally rich town, but we also want to have, great medical care, and there comes, I've seen this happen over the, 40 years I've been here, you got to make decisions, which you can't have it all. Because what was in the last general plan, what I'm seeing here, is just like a wish list, Christmas wish list of everything I want to have. But there's no structure in terms of these are the things that will get us to where we want to be in 30 years.
So I think some of that is a policy decision that is up to the city council at the time. Again, the general plan is a long-range document. It's a 20, 30-year shelf life. And so, we have to consider all the input we've received and try to identify the goals and policies to meet the future vision of the city. And you're right, some of the things we can't implement right away because of funding, but what the general plan allows us is when funding does become available, then we can say, okay, we have a grant for transportation or something of that sort. How can we use this money? Let's turn to the general plan and the accompanying implementation plan to see where we've already committed to the community that we would invest these dollars. And it's our roadmap, but it doesn't necessarily prioritize things. That's the city council's responsibility on an annual basis when they review the capital
I
improvement
understand,
program.
but to me, a roadmap that says, here's all the places in the world I possibly would ever want to visit, isn't of much use. And that really what this is the citizens' expression of what we want the city to look like in 30 years. And all of our actions should be towards getting to that vision. And one of the things the plan ought to do is help us make those hard decisions. I'm not saying the city council can't, use its own discretion, but the general plan ought to come out and say, these are the things that we think are most important. These other things, for instance, the last general plan said we need to develop geothermal energy.
Yeah.
We could put that in here. Sure, why not? Just throw everything in, into the bucket, but it's not helpful when you do that.
But be mindful that most of the policies are not budget-driven in a sense. What I mean by that, if you look for the energy policies, it's things like adopting certain levels of energy performance. Those are codes, those are ordinances. That doesn't require the city to pay for them as well. And you will see that the entertainment district, for example, the way that that's implemented, and again through the implementation measures, is to zone certain properties, which we've done, have identified the map around the baseball stadium. The city doesn't build the entertainment center. All you are doing to make that happen is you're creating the capacity of zoning and a land use designation that will enable that to happen. So be mindful that I think there's been trying to be care here that the only places, as I said, we're not going to have a capital improvements program as a part of this. That's a city does on a repeated basis as well. And nor are we defining, and what you cited as an example may have been inappropriate to be in the last general plan. And we're trying to avoid incorporating those kinds of things that are commitment to funds that cannot be guaranteed here.
Okay, again, I promise I won't, last comment. I'm just saying that when you include everything, when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority.
Well, define what priority is, because everything in here, that let's say requirements, okay?
I mean,
Tell me, we'll go through, and I don't want to, again, belabor here as well. What would not be a priority here? Because most of everything in here is basically following state law on issues of climate change and on elements such as, again, the safety requirements. All those are a reflection of what we now must have, cities must follow and
right,
do.
so our general plan ought to talk about the things that are optional, that we have control over, not the things we don't have control over.
Well, no, a general plan has to set in place under
Okay.
the guidelines what.
Well,
we
then
have to
I hope
implement.
somewhere else in the general plan, we talk about our vision for where we want the city to go and not simply reiterate state law.
Yeah, no, and you
That's
did.
what I'm saying.
That's why you wrote a vision statement up front, too.
Right.
Sort of as an extension of what Mr. Rothschild, I agree 100%. If there aren't any specifics, where does it come? I guess you kind of answered that. It's the city council, but even the city council needs direction as to where the priority is. And you asked, and during the community outreach, you asked people all these questions to give their priorities, and I went to almost every single one that you did, and there were specifics that they were citing, and yet when it comes to the general plan, it is still very vague. It's a general, and what we don't need anymore is a general. We need a more specific or specified in the goals and objectives and the policies.
I think there's other mechanisms outside the general plan that can achieve what both of you are saying. I don't disagree. There needs to be prioritization to help the city make decisions. And I think the city can do that in ways through, say, a strategic plan where it's more short-term that ties in with the general plan. It's consistent with the general plan, but it's more specific to the matters at hand right now and allows the city council to set those priorities on a more regular basis.
I think the city council, well, I'm going to leave it at that, but I think the city council needs guidelines, specific guidelines. Because what happens a lot of times is it becomes a wish list. And that's all. And if it's real vague, tomorrow we will be met with something else that we have to do, and so this gets pushed aside and whatever. And the only time I ever hear programs refer to the general plan is in planning commission, that this falls directly in line with the general plan, but it doesn't state in line with what or whatever. You have to look it up and compare it and see. I think that's a weak feature of this general plan, that it doesn't give any specifics. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Woody. Internal consistency, long-range plan, I understand that. But at least in my experience, what gets lost over time is the verification of these goals and policies, whether empirically, whether they're being fulfilled, and they're not just some pie-in-the-sky dream. So you mentioned strategic plan. what about a strategic plan element that can be incorporated within the general plan? I mean, since we're not limited to how many elements we can have in the general plan, I mean, is such a mechanism even possible that really will then compel staff to make sure that these strategies are being fulfilled empirically?
I think it's possible, yes, but then, as Woody mentioned previously, anytime you put something in the general plan, it becomes more challenging to amend it as the times and technology and demands change. And so a strategic plan is more of a living document that needs to be updated regularly.
Right.
And you don't necessarily want to open up the entire general plan to questions about CEQA, or there's also additional notification requirements whenever you do a general plan amendment. And so you want your strategic planning, your prioritization to be nimble and be able to change to changing demands.
One of the implementation programs that will be added to upfront in the plan, probably to the land use element, is in a implementation plan to periodically review the general plan and basically assess what's working and what's not working, and then provide a mechanism for updating the general plan. And in the plan we prepared for Sacramento, they are working on a 5-year cycle of updates, a review, thorough reviews and updates, et cetera. They are now on the second iteration of that, so they actually are acting to implement what they actually believed in when they adopted the general plan back 10 years ago. So that, I think, is very important. We talk about it being a long-term document, but as you know, we recognize things change, funding changes, legislation changes, et cetera. And you want it to be, I hate to use the term living and breathing, but you want it to be more living and breathing and more dynamic and adaptable to change. So that will be upfront in the plan document. One of the first implementation measures is to keep it alive by monitoring, assessing, report. The city also is required under state law to prepare something called an annual planning report, which up to date, has been primarily focused on housing, but it's more now. Climate change and your ability to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions is now also required to be documented, et cetera. So there are measures being, and you're going to see more on housing performance through the state. But again, I think the cities that do best by their general plans are the ones who recognize that it needs to be reviewed, because you may have had this incredibly great policy to do X, Y, and Z to create this entertainment district, and for some reason 5 years from now, 3 years from now, the property owners have a better idea. I'm pulling something from the air, whatever that better idea would be, and you want to be able to have that flexibility to adjust to the time. Maybe it's a new technology center of something, et cetera. So you want to have the ability to adjust. This is not something that should be poured in concrete, et cetera, and that you do have that ability to modify over time.
And I would just add, too, that I agree that the only time you hear about the general plan right now is at Planning Commission for planning cases, and it shouldn't be that way.
And that's just only one little phrase.
Yeah.
That it,
Exactly. It's just glossed over, and I don't agree with that either. It needs to be a citywide, it should be in the forefront of all decisions that the city makes in every department. It's a citywide document. Unfortunately, time goes on, and it's usually when a general plan is first adopted, there's a lot of energy behind it, and you get buy-in from all the electeds, and they understand the importance of the general plan, and it will be referred to over time. It's pretty consistent in most jurisdictions that it slowly becomes less important, but
over time, it's just very easy to forget.
Yep, and that's
Over time,
unfortunate.
it's just very easily to forget. And when you talk about amendments to the general plan, I was told that a general plan is fixed for 20 years and you don't want to mess with it once it's done, especially after all the work and everything that's gone into it. But it just seems too rigid, and too rigid for the city in our situation as it is. I think we have one comment. Mr. Mulvihill keeps raising his hands. Come up to the mic. You have 3 minutes.
Actually, I had a comment before. I did have a speaker slip in, but we missed the opportunity. But to answer Mr. Rothschild's question, and you mentioned the capital improvements program, that's where the money, every June, at the end of the budget year, you prioritize the parks you want to fix up, the streets you want to pave, and allocate it between all the zones. But that is part of the general plan. The general plan is just a visionary document that you want to have better streets, you want to have better parks, and so forth. Well, and the capital improvements discussion that takes place is exactly what you're talking about. It's a prioritization. It's a public document. In other words, when I first came to San Bernardino, the capital improvements plan I asked about, it was a list that the city engineer kept in his back pocket, not public. And someone would come up to him and say, can you put something in this, repave this street for me, et cetera, et cetera. Next, okay? It's the capital improvements program. The agenda, the public's agenda, I know, Woody, you're sort of planning, PlaceWorks, I'm going to say Planning Center.
Whatever.
PlaceWorks.
Whoever they are.
PlaceWorks is sort of responsible for the program side.
Yep.
But the agenda is not published on the program side. It's the thing, there's a comment there where you go down to the agenda and you go down to the meeting and it says materials to be posted, and nothing's there. And I had a heck of a time trying to find it on the city's site. It's not, if you go to the city's pull-down menu and you go to the GPAC and you try to get into the agenda for tonight, it's not there. But if you wrangle out a little bit and you sort of become visionary yourself, you finally work it through somehow. But it took me about a half hour to find this thing. And I know that, oh, by the way, Jim Mulvihill, AICP. Okay. But the agenda's not on the program.
Okay, well,
And it's also difficult to find on the city's website. Thank you.
we'll take care of that technical difficulty.
There's no convincing you. I think we all agree with what you say, right? We all agree with what you say. But those who have been here, those of us, and you have not, those of us who have been in the city long enough, sometimes don't see it realized. And departments often work in silos. The department is over here, and the police department over here, and everybody, and we don't reference each other. And I think all of Mr. Rata was asking was on more specifics, but less specific, so that it stays within the guidelines of the general plan, so that we do have guides, because after all, this is the plan. So that we have some guidelines as to how we prioritized or what we prioritized and so forth. But for tonight, let us continue.
We do have
Something I want to say.
2 more public comments, too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
This is a hot topic, okay.
yeah. I don't know how this fits in, but let's say Ward 5, and we have a pretty good existing general plan. Hasn't changed much up there. A developer wants to make changes, so he sells city council on a specific plan, and that gets approved. So changes can happen if a developer wants it to happen, and he gets the city council to go with it. That's just my comment. How do you deal with a specific plan when it really doesn't fit the area?
Yeah, so we as staff evaluate that and we provide a recommendation. We demonstrate whether it is or is not consistent with the general plan for any project. We do that, including if someone comes forward with a specific plan. And ultimately, it's the planning commission and ultimately the city council that make the decision on whether or not to approve a specific plan that may be in conflict with the general plan.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, maybe there's an amendment to the general plan and that can be done. There's a process. Also, the city council has the authority to do that as well.
I'll use, for example, Spring Trails. I'm sure you're well aware of it. The residents up there doesn't want higher density. And the specific plan allows it because the developer, the Spring Trails was turned down twice by Planning Commission. He went to City Council, sold City Council on it, and they approved it. So now we got a proposed subdivision up there eventually, may happen, but it's higher density and it doesn't fit the area.
Understood. We can talk about that at another time, so.
Move on.
Wait, 2 public comments before we move on, please. Eddie? That way they can get them done.
We're sorry, Eddie, we missed you, but we're here, you're here now.
It's okay. Thank you for having me. I am with the Southwest Mountain Regional Council of Carpenters. My name is Eddie Campos. I am here because I am a member of the community nearby, and I know that a lot of these projects impact us, especially being part of our council. The city should incorporate language into the proposed municipal code amendments requiring residential, commercial, and mixed-use developments to be built with contractors that will hire locally, pay prevailing wages, and utilize apprenticeships from state-certified apprenticeship training programs. Workforce requirements reduce construction-related environmental impact while benefiting the local economy and workforce development. In a recent 2020 report titled Putting California on the High Road, a Jobs and Climate Act Plan for 2030, the California Workforce Development Board concluded that investments in growing, diversifying, and upskilling California workforce can positively affect returns on climate mitigation efforts. South Coast Air Quality Management District recently found that the local hire requirements can result in air pollutant reduction. Recently, the state of California reiterated its commitment towards encouraging workforce development and housing affordability through the Affordable Housing and High Roads Act of 2022, otherwise known as Assembly Bill 2011, which requires projects pay workers a prevailing wage and hire from a state-certified apprenticeship program for projects meeting certain sidings, affordability, and development standards. Once again, thank you very much for having us.
Ryan?
Hello, I'm Ryan Stanley, and I'm a business owner in the building representing the Historic Enterprise Building in downtown San Bernardino. Just want to share in terms of planning goals. It's great that there is a general plan that we're working on and being represented in downtown as a major economic center is very exciting, and going to speak a little bit more on the historical part and safety part later today. But in terms of the general plan, I'm also a historian for the city and have researched and read the past 70 years of downtown and overall city planning books, and have realized that for the most part in our city's history, especially recent, there have been a lot of ideas, but not a lot of plans. Things that are concrete, things that succeed and are thought out. And out of all the fancy great pictures, you have a lot of still abandoned dirt lots today, most of which were historic buildings. So I, a part of city planning, have researched over 1,000 major downtowns across the entire globe, and came across this great book by Jeff Speck, who's a major urban planner. It's called Walkable City Rules. Here, it's a little textbook sort of thing, but each 2 pages is one rule, and it's how to really develop a great walkable economic center, especially for downtowns. So I highly, highly encourage the committee board and just overall citizens of the area that attend these meetings to read this and come prepared to make a big impact in a short amount of time. Finally, something that I worked on over the summer is with the Aspen Institute for our San Bernardino Playbook project, is the world's first enterprise district, which I believe was incorporated to be 9 square blocks of downtown, That's very exciting. And with that, I really want to just hammer that in, that it being the world's first is a great marketing opportunity, but also just something that encourages growth and entrepreneurism in downtown. So, thank you.
Could you, what is the title of the book
Yeah.
that you're holding?
And the author.
Walkable City Rules. So there is one called Walkable Cities, and that's more of just a general reading book, but this is for people that want to make a difference, he says. Walkable City Rules, 101 Steps to Making Better Places.
And where did you get your copy?
I got this one on Amazon.
It's available on Amazon, yeah.
Amazon, yes. And the author is Jeff, Geff, Speck, Speck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You will note when you read the specific plan for downtown, a lot came out of that book.
Really?
It's a good book.
Do we have any other speakers, Jessica? Okay, then we can go on.
Yeah, we'll move on. So as I said, we're going to move on to water and energy. And again, as we go through this, again, hearing some of the concerns that you had, I think one of the other kind of measures to look at from your assessment of what is in here in terms of the goals and policies are any of those that you do feel that are inherently conflict with something else that is being a part of the general plan and direction of the general plan. And if you see anything that is conflicting, let us know and let's have a discussion about it, because I'll keep going back to the basic mantra earlier, is there shouldn't be conflicts internally within this document. So we'll start with that. And if you again see something that is concerning to you in terms of the reality of making it happen, bring that up, because I think that's useful for us to hear as we move forward and question whether we would indeed want to incorporate it within the plan document itself. So, starting with the first goal, and these are paraphrases, they're not the exact wording that's in the document, et cetera, so it's basically characterization of what the goal is. I'm not going to read the goal verbatim here, it is in your document, but the basic focus of the first document, goal is the reduction of energy and the policies, energy consumption throughout the community itself. And without reading the bullets below, which are the various policies to deal with that and address that, is basically such things as using energy efficient appliances, lighting and materials. This is something that basically Cal Green, the California Building Code, now requires by verbatim, so it's basically already a given. The direction we're moving into in the second bullet of moving to net zero energy, but rather than basically saying the city shall require this of all private development, we're not there yet. We'll wait till the state gets there, but indeed most cities are adopting this as their own city policy, that the city will move towards net zero energy. And encouraging this is where the word encourage, because we thought it's inappropriate to mandate it at this point in time about moving beyond the state and Cal Green standards for energy. The other item was to, again, periodically require energy audits of public buildings to make sure that they're performing in a way that is reducing energy consumption. Another strategy, the next bullet down, is about, again, one of the ways that we get individuals and communities buying into energy conservation is educational programs. It may be a flyer. You often walk into a city hall and there'll be flyers about how you can retrofit your house to be more energy efficient, et cetera. Basically, building designs for heat gain, how you orient the building has a relationship to that. And then promoting, again, something we didn't want to require as a part of this plan, but again, this is a case where the word was chosen carefully to make it permissive, but the idea of promoting cooling roofs as a way to reduce energy conservation. So I'm going to go through all of the energy ones and then come back again for the opportunity as well. The next goal are strategies and policies to about increasing renewables, if you will, as an energy source, and a number of policies addressing about how we transition to low carbon and carbon-free energy sources, increase installation of on-site renewable. Again, this is promoting that. So if you have a large master plan development community, that you would promote on-site renewable energy systems such as solar, wind, other wind, so forth. Protect solar exposure. This is in a building code, how you do that as you placement of buildings, that you do not interrupt the ability of your neighbor can't build a building that's going to block the solar axis if you put solar panels on your roof, for example, and which is also the fourth bullet down and so forth. Encouraging the installation of battery storage systems. Some communities now are, depending upon the scale of, let's say, the commercial project, larger projects are basically, in some cases, are being required. This is just encouraging it, however, for battery storage systems to be incorporated within the larger facilities. City facilities, looking at the potential use of energy recovery projects, and then also supporting local serving renewable energy projects. There are a series of projects in Oakland, in the older part, in the low-income parts of Oakland, that are basically retrofitting neighborhoods in a very creative way in a partnership with the City of Oakland and with PG&E, sometimes a bad name to use in the Bay Area, but PG&E, in terms of creating local renewable energy systems within blocks of neighborhoods that are reducing energy consumption and the cost of energy for homes. And then to assist low-income homeowners and businesses, which is sort of the Oakland model, with energy refits, some benefits for them as well. That is this. And then similarly, well, let me stop at those first two goals. Anything on those first two goals of issues or concerns before I move into the water, as we're moving into water afterwards? Yeah, Rafi.
Yes, I noticed that some of the policies are crossed out. Why is that?
That's been, yeah, you're looking at an older vision. What we have done is they've crossed them out and they've been integrated with other policies. So for example, you'll see one there that Jim brought to my attention, Jim Overhead brought to my attention, that looks like it crossed out lead. It's been moved into another policy.
Got it.
As well. So it's been reorganized for clarity. And it's also been reorganized in some cases, language to make sure it's consistent with where we are in terms of the California energy codes.
Got it. And who developed these codes or the policies?
We wrote them.
Okay,
We have an energy staff.
got it. Thank you.
I've got two questions. The first one is that I spent some time in Boulder, Colorado, which is probably one of the more aggressively managed cities. And they offered incentives to companies based in the city if their employees lived nearby. So I don't recall the exact formula they had, but the closer their employees lived, the more advantageous it was for the company. Is that a policy that we can consider? Because that turns into energy and infrastructure reduction.
So give me some clarity about what if you live near the company, what do you get?
So they were offering tax incentives to the companies if their employees
To locate there?
if their employees were located within 5 miles of the company,
Yeah, that's
as opposed to long-term commutes,
Yeah.
which come at a high cost to all of us.
Exactly, and it's also a land use strategy as well, but let me write that down as a note.
Okay, thank you. Because that would be great to see if we can incentivize that somehow. In fact, one of the companies in Boulder, Celestial Seasonings, built an apartment complex for their employees, specifically so that they had affordable housing.
There have been some articles recently about, well, we're going back to company towns, using that term, which used to be a nomenclature. Used to carry a lot of baggage.
Not quite a company town,
Yeah,
but at
but
least it provided a
understand.
reasonable option.
Company-created housing.
The other question I had for you, and I don't know if energy is addressed elsewhere in the general plan, but one of the concerns I've had that I expressed earlier is the transition to electric vehicles in California, that we have substantial parts of the city which are going to have a difficult time implementing residential charging.
Yeah.
Is that something that we can or should address in the general plan?
In general, yes. I mean, the high level providing that opportunity. And it will be, and the shift to electric vehicles is going to be in the mobility element, et cetera. That's where you see the overlap.
I understand the, the implementation is beyond the private sector. But the city has to consider how we're gonna do this for these high-density existing apartments, as well as residences that don't have attached garages, driveways, et cetera. That's an opportunity where the city and our land use planning can take a hard look at how can we help the private sector implement an electric charging option for that existing housing.
Yep. Good ideas. Anything else on these two?
One of the things that I'm seeing, at least in my process of planning projects, the introduction of these charging units within gas stations. More and more gas are incorporating these charging stations.
The problem is it's, 20 to 30 minutes for a quick charge.
Okay, we'll move on to then the policies, back here, water resources. Similarly, as we have on energy, another topic of, it seems like for some, that topic disappeared the last couple weeks, but it's still a big issue out there and will continue to be, et cetera. So again, about basically, as we're looking at monitoring the general plan, is also to monitor in the water conservation efforts of the community over a period of time to see how well we're performing, because that provides database and information about whether one changes your approach to dealing with it. Requiring water conservation facilities and new construction. This is pretty much a given under the state building codes. Similarly, as we were talking about education in the community about the use of energy and alternative forms of energy, education about water conservation. Again, often I've walked into city halls and there have been brochures about how you as a resident can either retrofit or how you can conserve your water resources as well. Moving to reclaimed water for landscaping and non-contact uses, and to incorporate in the city's infrastructure dual plumbing to enable you to shift to reclaimed water instead of just potable water. More cities are doing that. That would obviously be the public works folks who have taken a look at this. Water efficient landscapes. This was, we're pretty much moving in that direction anyway in terms of mandates from water agencies. The use of permeable surfaces where you are able to, rather than have the water run off of, let's say, a deck in your backyard, that it actually goes through permeable into the groundwater resource. And restricting water hookups to comply where necessary to make sure that we don't exceed our ability to have adequate domestic water supply as well, to limit that where it may be necessary. That's the policies on increase, and then their goal is also that it's resilient over time, which means like in years like we're having right now, that we're able to capture and store that water in terms of the water storage capacity and supporting the water district in doing that. That's something the city doesn't do per se, but we have a water district that does. And so these two policies are really related with collaborating and working with the appropriate water service agencies, both the local and the regional agencies, on their provision of the water resources themselves. I'll stop there. The next two are on high quality, maintaining the quality of water. Any comments on these two particular goals or policies? Seeing none. Moving ahead to the maintenance, we obviously want to have, we actually have a fair number of policies on this. There are two slides here, but related to goal 13.5. The basic objective here is we've got good water. And it's not going to be polluted. It's not going to, we hear stories, horror stories of other cities that have been facing problems of water contamination and the impacts upon that on the communities themselves. So basic requirements that development does not degrade the water quality, and if and whether degradation does occur because there's a spillage of something, oil, whatever, into a water source, et cetera, that water quality, that impact is mitigated, reduced and improved, et cetera. Where we have septic systems to over time promote the replacement of those septic systems, because septic systems inherently leak and pollute groundwater and are not considered to be, something that is environmentally sustainable. Channeling your stormwater runoff into systems so that you do not create, again, pollutants. For example, every year, when we have our first rainstorm, we always hear about the runoff of our streets and highways because of the oils and the tars that have built up on the highway, et cetera, create a significant pollution burden upon the water resources themselves. So cities are looking at installing various kinds of pollution control mechanisms to capture and affect that as well. Best management practices, it's related to that, to prevent and control discharges that are of polluting nature. Construction themselves, new projects as a city to manage their stormwater discharges. So this is largely, a larger project. Let's say you have that project that was mentioned up in the Vermont area, you would definitely want any project like that to manage the stormwater discharges so it doesn't create pollution, anything of any scale, and runoff into the groundwater. There are projects in Seattle that control and manage all of their stormwater discharge on site. And I wish I had brought the images of it. The city of Santa Monica has implemented a new system where they captured 100% of the runoff of the city in a new facility near City Hall. They've created it into a series of groundwater cisterns and treated that water and be able, using it, reclaiming that water as well for non-potable uses itself. Hillside development obviously has a concern because you get the runoff of the hillsides and any kind of erosion that occurs and sedimentation that occurs and potentially pollutes it. So requiring any hillside development to incorporate vegetation, which absorbs the water in a way that prevents the runoff of the surface themselves. Minimize disturbance of natural water bodies, minimize the amount of impervious surfaces, et cetera, and then develop and maintain and basically the water agencies and Public Works do this as maintaining a sustainable stormwater management plan and urban runoff reduction plan. Any questions about these policies, comments?
On floodwater and conservation, the flood control channels are underneath the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, well, yeah, our
And
friends.
I've been in some meetings with them, some time ago, and brought up, sediment pond. I said, we don't care about that. Our job is to prevent flooding. That's all we're here for.
I know.
Wow.
Talk to the folks in the LA River, Friends of LA River, about that.
I mean, I thought, wow, that was kind of not what we're talking about.
They speaking of inconsistencies, they are inconsistent. In working on the new campus of the University of California, Merced, we had on the site, the 11,000 acres of the campus site, we had what were called vernal pools. The Army Corps of Engineers, because they are technically listed as waters of the United States, technically have jurisdiction over those waters. They didn't want what you're looking at, keeping maybe the floodways, the river, and some of the other areas natural. The Army Corps of Engineers has this hat called flood people, and then they have this other group of people called their environmental people. And there are two different groups within the Army Corps of Engineers, and sometimes you start pulling your hair out about them as well. But yes, the city can't control that, et cetera, so we can't have a policy here that says require the Army Corps of Engineers to do X, Y, and Z. Okay. Anything else on water supply? Okay, if not that, given the gentleman that was here in the room, we're going to move into historic and archaeological resources. Much of this is from the existing general plan. But obviously, the first goal is that we're going to protect these resources because they're important to the history and to the character of the community as well. So the first is basically that the city should have a plan on, what they're going to do. How are you going to protect those resources themselves? You want to update your survey. Mr. Mulvihill presented to me a document that was, what year was it, inventory?
1991.
The normal time frame for declaring considering a building to be historic is 50 years. So that's 30-plus years ago, and there have been a lot of buildings in that 30 years that are probably 50 years of age and longer. So basically, the second policy is you want to update that survey. That's the last, I believe, comprehensive survey that's been done for the city of et cetera, which would also, by the way, be something that will be called out in the environmental impact report as a mitigation measure for protection of historic resources. A lot of these things here you're going to see as mitigation in the environmental impact report. And then the third bullet down is that if you're a developer, as looking at the downtown plan, is that you consider the significant resources when you're developing that plan. So, for example, when they're looking at the Carousel Mall site, the thoughts about preserving some of the existing buildings, et cetera, the one that was mentioned already in developing the plan. The possibility of adopting historic district and overlay zones as a strategy to help as a part of that plan, that where you are integrating new development with a historic building, that you have design compatibility, et cetera, that is reflective of the building. You want something of the same scale and character of reflection in that particular district. Promoting the adaptive reuse, as the gentleman spoke earlier about the adaptive reuse of historic structures. Rather, there's also a climate, if you will, imperative in that, because it has the carbon retention in terms of the building is much better than demolishing, if you will, that building and constructing an entire new building. So where we can is to adaptively reuse the buildings as possible. Sometimes it's not financially feasible, but you indeed want to encourage that and support that. And then consider, when you're reviewing plans, and this is by CEQA, do this anyway, is you're considering your historic resources within the building themselves. There are some additional policies on protection and preservation of that, and then we'll get to the second goal. Basically, that if there are some architecturally significant buildings there that have been an important part of the community, that you, again, it goes along with the adaptive reuse, but to renovate those if there's in some state of deterioration, if feasible. And then if there's some overriding reason, and I've seen cities do this, is move a building from one site to another that's of architectural significance because that building needs to be replaced for some other overarching reason on that particular site. So this basically provides that direction. Maintaining historically significant public buildings. CEQA review of any projects requiring historic structures, that's almost a given. Training, this is sort of an interesting one. A lot of, basically, I don't want to say naivete, but depending upon city's staff size, and this is not demeaning any of the people sitting here around me, is basically to make sure that the staff that you have working within your city have some sensitivity and awareness of the importance and the history of the buildings and the resources that are within the community, and training them, especially if they are at the table on development review, about what are the techniques, particularly the federal standards and other standings for how you can modify or retain significant buildings and what you can really change in design of a building, et cetera. The staff needs to be trained and understand the importance as well as the requirements, et cetera. Along with the plan is to consider adopting an ordinance for the preservation of historic buildings or districts, and then maintaining an archive of records of historic buildings and sites. So let me stop there before we go on to the funding. Any question about the whole group of policies here, again, focusing upon that primary goal. We're going to protect those resources. Those are important resources that reflect the history and character of the community. Okay. If not, I hear
Under historical development, you have 11.1.5, character of historical buildings and areas. Is there someone now who takes care of that?
I'll defer to city staff.
Because I hate to mention specific, but in the downtown area, one building next to a site that the building historically looks like it would be, the painting has nothing to consistent with the buildings on the street. And that now that the Heritage Building is undergoing renovation, is there somebody that is looking into that to make sure that it's consistent with the architecture and everything of the building?
So we don't have a dedicated historic preservation staff or the internal expertise. So when we get projects of historic buildings, I believe there was a survey done, and I'm not entirely familiar because we haven't had that happen in the 8 months I've been here where there's been a historically significant building. But there was a survey done that identified the important buildings in the city. And so we refer to that to determine the impact.
Or not even if they're historic per se, per nature, but just as there is the coloring, the painting, and everything consistent in the street block, that I would think we would have somebody that.
Generally, we don't consider paint color. We'll look at, this is for any project, we'll look at the materials used, and we want to make sure they're using a mix of materials and not just a plain stucco box. We want architectural features and contrasting colors, but we don't necessarily dictate
So if
specific
if
colors.
somebody just paints their building purple, which it is down there,
There's nothing in the
There's
code
nothing-
that would prohibit them from doing so. Sometimes it's just a negotiation or asking nicely.
well, that one, 11.1.5 sounds as if we want to ensure compatibility and consistency with the design or the
Yeah.
art of the building, or something that would be.
Right.
So if we adopt that.
Yeah, and then there's an opportunity, because we are doing a development code update as well, there may be opportunities to put that in the code so that there's more teeth to it when there's, in certain areas or in the downtown specific plan.
Otherwise, we have a patchwork. Thank you.
I'm sorry, speak in the microphone. Right. It could be. Basically, it is one of the areas that is pretty much required for a community to check off if there's an historic building.
And in terms of what level of environmental review, that'll be determined by historical an expert in historic preservation that will do an analysis and determine the impact. Pardon me?
Would it be, a required review of project involving historic structures, having an expert or someone on staff that could make that determination, this is a historic structure, and having go through that process sequel, which just prolongs, delays the execution of a project.
What this is really saying is you're going to have CEQA review of projects anyway. And again, you make a determination. You have an initial study. Not going to get into housing right now because you may have more expedited review on that. But if you normally have a review process, it's basically saying that one of the measures that you should assess is, whether there's a historic building on the site, and if so, you need to evaluate it. and the consequences and the impacts upon that building.
And some cities have a historic preservation
Officers,
officer
yeah.
that's, works with the state historic preservation office. And some cities have a board or a committee that evaluates historic projects.
City of Los
We do not.
Angeles, it's a different city, but City of Los Angeles, a bigger city, has a actual division within its planning department of people who work on nothing but historic preservation efforts and reviewing historic projects as well. And there was a book just written called Preserving Los Angeles by him. It's a great book to take a look at.
I'm sorry, I have a question. How many historical buildings do we have here, San Bernardino? Do we know?
I think the term historic buildings, it's a spectrum of buildings and what is determined historic. And so there's, well, is it,
Architecturally, culturally.
Architecturally or culturally important? Was it designed by an important architect? And is it a unique example of a particular architectural style? Does it represent a period or an industry or something? There's all different. An important person. So, and then there's different eligibility, whether it's locally eligible for preservation, state, or federal registry. So the more important a building is, the higher level it could achieve. So we've done, to my knowledge, there's a citywide survey of properties. I don't know how many properties were surveyed or identified in that survey. Certainly there's opportunities to do more. I think there's a lot of amazing buildings in the city that are just overlooked or maybe not elevated to where they need to be in the city. So, and that's, certainly those types of things that we can look at when we do the implementation tools is, identify sources of funding to do additional studies or hire staff or consultants or whatever to do more historic preservation work.
Very good, thank you.
Speaking of funding, the next goal is there are various sources of funding out there to fund not only the study, but they actually fund the preservation effort as well. So your first policy is to make folks aware, like those of us in the room here, about what those state and federal financial and other incentives are out there for funding as well. If a person has a property which they have an historic building, they may have absolutely no awareness whatsoever of the opportunity to indeed fund for that improvement as well. And then there are basically here seeking funding opportunities for restoration, renovation of any city-owned historic and significant buildings, working with and supporting owners of historic buildings and sites, and again, acquiring funding, support organizations that involved in historic preservation, and there are some out there, adopting ordinances for the preservation of historic buildings, and educating staff about the California Historic Building Code, which again has specific requirements upon how you can alter a historic building as well on that. So again, basically this is about funding, that there are sources of funding, that you should seek funding where you can. It's not saying the city is going to commit funding for this purpose. It's basically saying explore those opportunities that are out there to use that funding that may be available, educate the community about it and how to get there, property owners who may be involved, and have the staff also educated in respect to what the code basically says and requires as well. Any question about any of those? Comments on any of those?
Going back to the previous sections, in the conversation that we had, is there any point in here where we're encouraging a study of historic? Should that be written, or something we put down, or is that already like a study of historic buildings in San Bernardino?
I thought we had that in here. It basically said, update the inventory.
I know we talked about it, but I don't see it.
Yeah, we do. On the very first slide, I'll go back for a second. Updated, second bullet, updated historic resources reconnaissance survey.
Okay.
Okay, also, one of the goals basically is that there's community awareness and appreciation of these resources, and basically a number of opportunities through educational institutions, through involved in any historic preservation commission meetings, et cetera. Cultural tourism is sometimes a effective, again, mechanism for people to appreciate. And then once you have some inventory, many cities will have these self-guided tours. You know, here's a walk that you can take, and sometimes they'll put landmarks on it or signage, et cetera, on it of where the historic buildings, and that's kind of a cultural tourism kind of opportunity as well. To promote that, it could be for residents as well as for visitors to the city, to capitalizing upon those resources. So it becomes something that sort of helps identify the city and helps, identifying the special nature of the city of San Bernardino by that kind of, if you will, activity. And I'll jump to the last slide and then ask anything on for preservation is about the archaeological resources. These are the things that may be buried, who may have history that are not current buildings in place that we were in the earlier policies looking at protecting. So there are maps available of areas of archaeological sensitivity. We, as a part of, there's a background study that was prepared for this project, or the general plan that has this information. We can't provide you with the maps of the sites, though you might like to know. I've learned very much in my career that archaeologists don't like to identify specific sites for the public because they're afraid that the person and the individual is going to go out and pick up the Indian, arrow or whatever, the shards, the pottery shards that may be left on the site. The tribes actually are this is a issue for the tribes as well, the native tribes as well. So basically we keep what was called a area of sensitivity and map. So it's a big boundary that covers about a third of the city. Think of the foothill areas and the areas along the streams. And then also basically that there are protections. Again, this is obviously something that you address in environmental as well, but requirements for protection of significant sites, and you coordinate that with the Native American tribes. And we've all heard indeed the importance of this to the native tribes and the opportunity for the tribes to review development projects within areas of sensitivities. And then there's a specific South Coastal Information Center and the consultation with the American tribes. And so this is sort of the basic, and the most significant archaeological resources here are, again, related to the indigenous populations that were here before any of the rest of us were here. Any questions on these or comments on the latter two slides? Goals.
I think we've got something like that sort of in place. Jim, where'd Jim go? Disappeared.
Yes, sir.
Somebody help me. He writes an article, everybody knows him. He writes an article about, maybe once a month for the paper. He is part of the Historical Society of San Bernardino. Who?
Nick?
Yeah, Nick.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and he writes a lot of, it's fascinating. So we kind of have something like that.
Yeah, this is a reflection of that as well. So it's basically continuing what you may have in place. Not all these are new. In other words, as I said, some of these, much of this particular section is also derived from your existing document as well. But these have been in place, and it's been the norm for cities, especially on these relative to the archaeological resources, to implement these practices for a long time.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the last element. We're actually getting,
Oh, I have a comment.
okay, back to the comment.
So in regards to the historical element and preservation in San Bernardino, we haven't done a great job in recent years. Just sharing from my experience with the historic building and being surrounded by other abandoned city-owned historic buildings and large properties owned by large corporations that don't even have a presence in this continent. It's unfortunate, especially with the Harris Building next door, which has been flooded for the past 9 months. But for our building in particular, the Historic Enterprise Building, if you aren't familiar with our building, it's a cornerstone building in downtown San Bernardino, just across from this building up East Street. And in terms of being historic, does anyone, just asking, do you know the difference between historical and historic? So historical means old. There's a lot of historical buildings that fall under the preservation because they're being, 50 years old. But historic means important. Our building and several other major buildings in downtown would be considered historic. Our building in particular is a 1927 Howard E. Jones, who's a famed local architect, designed the Harris Building, the county courthouse, the city hall in Riverside, etc. Designed our building, and also in terms of being so historic, even as a new building in 1927, the county government actually moved their official elevation benchmarker to the side of our building. So it's very historic, and I'll go on because our 96th anniversary is just coming up in May. And I'm putting together some things that are encouraged in this document, such as a history tour and educational seminars. That's in May. But I just want to say, in terms of really helping keep the heritage of the city of San Bernardino, the historic buildings, once they're gone, they are gone forever. And I've made it a goal of mine and something very important to me of doing the research about our building, having gone through over 4,000 newspaper pages back to 1867. And yes, so preserve the history. Thank you.
All right, Karen Suarez.
Good evening, Karen Suarez. I'm a resident of the 7th Ward. I'm also the director of Uplift San Bernardino at the Making Hope Happen Foundation. I love the idea of the cultural tours. It's something that our network has been talking about for a long time because there's a lot of really interesting things about our city, especially the number of families who own restaurants and food businesses that have been here for decades and families that have been here for decades who operate businesses. So it'd be really cool to do that. I just had a couple of questions about the water part. I didn't see any reference to like lead or pollutants, or is that something that's also addressed in the water, in this water portion? Because there are a lot of older homes in our community. My house, for example, is from 1926. And so some of them still have old pipes, and I don't know if there should be any reference to the fact that that's something that residents do face, especially our older residents who are on fixed incomes. They have challenges in being able to replace those things. So I don't know if that's a program but it'd be nice to have incentives to replace that piping. And the other one is related to, I know you talked about, or maybe you're going to talk about it next, is wind.
It's coming up.
Oh, okay, so should I save my comment for that section? Okay, I'll save my comment for that section. And then I just wanted to echo what Mr. Stanley said about preserving the history. We do have a lot of really beautiful structures and buildings here, especially in our downtown area. And sadly, we've seen some really cool buildings burn down. And so whatever we can do to mitigate that, I love the idea of having, the other thing too, is that the city, you don't have to do this alone. they're community residents and community-based organizations who, we're here for the long haul. And so, we'd love to be partners in coming up and dreaming up with some of these activities. Ryan on his own is doing all this research and sharing it with others. And so just know that it's not a solo effort. Thank you.
Jim Penman?
Here, Mr. Stanley talking about the building he's presently in. Thought I'd waste a little bit of your time with a couple of historical things about San Bernardino. I was director of the Home and Neighborly Service on Mount Vernon. In the 1970s, it was built in 1926, and I was able to get the state to designate it a point of historical interest based on the historical impact it had had and involvement with San Bernardino's Latino and Black communities. And what I did not know then, and also the architectural style Mission Revival enabled us to get that designation, which worked out later when we had a mayor in the 70s who wanted to tear down anything that was over 50 years old. And Home and Neighborly Service was built without reinforced metal rebar. So they were trying to tear everything down, and we were able to stop that. But I learned later that the architect of that building is also the architect of a residence on Valencia, north of 30th, just south of, 3 doors south of Marshall on the west side of the street. The architect of the Home and Neighborly Service and that residence, which looked very similar, was the architect of the Pentagon in Virginia, across the river. And he designed, I believe he lived in San Bernardino, and he designed that. And I don't know that I had ever read that anywhere, and I've done a lot of study in San Bernardino history. But we lost the California Hotel. We lost a lot of the old adobes because this particular mayor wanted to knock them down because it's easier for developers to purchase emptied land and build less expensive. And this is a really important part of the general plan, in my opinion, to preserve these historical buildings. And the final thing was he got an ordinance passed that any building of unreinforced masonry had to be torn down. And the city attorney, I was able to get that amended to comply with state law. We only had to require the buildings to post warning signs. This building is unreinforced masonry, enter at your own risk. And that complied with the state law. But for a short time, we had on the books a requirement that any building in San Bernardino built unreinforced masonry had to be demolished. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to, clipping my papers, moving on to the last section, which, and wind is coming up in these topics, is the safety element. This, again, is probably one of the sections and elements that has been subject to the most change in terms of policy, because, again, the topics induced by requirements that now the safety elements must be updated now on the same time frame as the housing element. So in the future, when you get your next iteration of the housing element, we've said all these other elements technically have a longer lifespan. The safety element does not. The safety element now has also an 8-year time frame for it, and that's recent legislation. And it's partially attributable to the need to respond to the potential impacts of climate change, recognizing that our environment is changing, hazards of potential risk of fire, as we know, the photo above, as well as other risks of things like the kind of intense rainstorms we've had recently, as well as concerns about flooding and all sorts of other particular issues. We had for years the concerns about seismicity, which has been on the book. That hasn't really, the laws there haven't changed very much. On earthquake faults, and we know we are bisected by a couple of major earthquake faults here. And we have other risks like landslides and obviously change of wind patterns as well. So the nature and the scope of the policies here, if you go back to compare with your existing element, are much more expansive and much lengthier and much more detailed because of the actual requirements now of what content must be addressed, not basically directed on how you address the content, but the content. So with that, the first goal is related to something that has been, I think, California and cities in California has been at the head of the game of this from most other states that we hear about tornadoes and other things that are happening throughout the United States. We have for years had among the best, and I think it's because we have a history of wildfire in particular, et cetera. We have and earthquakes. We have had operations and cooperative agreements among cities, mutual aid agreements, et cetera, in terms of being able to respond to earthquakes and respond to fires, et cetera. So, you know, when you're fighting a fire in the foothills, it's not just the city of San Bernardino fire, but you've got adjoining cities who also come out and work with you on that. If we've got a major earthquake, you've got multiple cities who are all pulling their resources together to address as well. So the first series of policies are about maintaining and continuing the emergency response programs that are in place and expanding upon those in the future. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail because I think they're fairly obvious, but the one is obviously you're going to maintain a functional emergency operations plan, which includes not only the response after you've had an event, but also the preparation in advance. So the drills that you hear about, et cetera, the educational programs for the community, being an awareness to indeed what the potential risks are, et cetera. So under the policies, again, about maintaining the operations plan, about having preparedness programs, continuing those, and this is the new a specific item added through state law is that the understanding and the awareness of the emergency evacuation routes. This probably grows out of the Paradise fire up north a couple of years ago with education and outreach to residents so that there's a knowledge of anybody who lives in the community about where their evacuation route. You think about the evacuation routes we have in our office buildings. You have a sign, you know, on the floor. You go to the stairway or elevator. Or you don't go to the elevator or wherever you're going for exit, et cetera. So basically the knowledge in the second bullet about those, the maps we attached to the second document we produced, we sent you, has a indication of the areas of the city that are at evacuation risk, et cetera. The third bullet, again, maintaining the mutual aid agreements with your cities, providing emergency access, obviously, to the critical high occupancy essential facilities. Think hospitals, think that is an essential facility, et cetera. Once a damage occurs, is in terms of emergency responses, having a pretty rapid damage assessment strategy and how you're going to assess what the damage is, and then post-disaster recovery, and then we think about how identifying and securing funding for damage and reconstruction after an event, et cetera. And then obviously one very specific item is to locate, this again is a requirement of law, to locate critical and essential facilities outside of flood hazard areas. That's things like police stations, fire stations, plus the health facility that I mentioned previously as well. There is another slide here. We've actually quite a few in emergency response programs, so let me go through all of these on emergency response. Expanding the capabilities of your CERT, Community Emergency Response Team. It's an organization within the city of various departments and entities, police, fire, et cetera, in terms of responding to that. The requiring new development to provide adequate safety and fire protection and effective evacuation routes requirement. The third bullet's the new, if you will, requiring, under state law, requiring 2 points of access and evacuation for development in high fire hazard areas. Again, we had a map earlier of where those are, and a city is about 50% or 40% within technically a high fire hazard risk areas. And instead of the subdivisions where you might have had a cul-de-sac, basically you can no longer build a cul-de-sac. Design tracks with cul-de-sacs, you have to have 2 points, point in, point out, for all kind of areas in high fire hazard areas as well. Again, that's state law. Having a multi-hazard evacuation plan, again, it's part of the, and identifying the routes, et cetera. Then the last slide on the response program is, again, education, working with the fire department, working with the districts, because this is a cooperative entity as well. And then there are individuals out there, as we often hear in case of fires or other emergencies, people who may be, because of their age, because of their health conditions, et cetera, may be limited in their mobility and able to evacuate or able to move or respond themselves, help themselves during the case of so there's a requirement, again, under state law for assistance program for persons with limited mobility or who do not have an automobile. So it may not just be a person who has a physical inability but maybe a low-income household that has no access to a vehicle to be able to move as well. And then there is also the notion of what's called resilience hubs, technical, one piece of jargon that's in this is resilience hubs, where you basically offering refuge from disasters. It's basically the places where people can go congregate, get their food, places to sleep, and shelter in an event. These are all part of the package that would be in that master emergency response plan, which is really the first bullet. Any questions or comments about this?
Yeah, I've got one. It happened with the last major fires we had here 20 years ago. It happened last month with the major snows up in the mountains. The citizens need a single, authoritative, resilient source of information. Authoritative information, because what was happening last month was if you called the county, they'd say, oh, you need to talk to Caltrans. That's a Caltrans decision. Caltrans would say, oh, you need to talk to the Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department would say, you need to talk to the Fire Department. We need a single, and this needs to be something that is known well in advance to the citizens, where to go for authoritative information about road closures, evacuation routes, shelters, services, whatever it might be. Because after the snows, we even saw various politicians setting up their own information channels. And it was just a mess trying to get any sort of authoritative information.
And I remember watching the press coverage and saw lots of issues, people on their cell phone not knowing who to call, or they would call 3 or 4 different numbers or to trying to get the access. Yep. Thank you. Good addition.
We have an area in the city that has a potential, because we read the paper, we've got lately a lot of railroad accidents. And that pathway where the main track comes down, I know some years ago before I was here, there was some kind of a big spill there that was a major run. So well, my point is that should be, or maybe we're addressing it, areas that are potential and have special plans for that area, because there's housing all around those rail lines and everything else. So maybe I don't know, maybe plans, I don't know, something that would.
Some, again, ability to deal with that response as well. This
Specifically for that area.
Technically, this element is supposed, but I think this needs to be in the general plan, some direction on that. This element technically focuses on natural hazards, and that technically is not a natural hazard to be, minuscule, but you want that kind of protection for a safe community and to being able to deal with that. So let us think about how we deal with that.
Terrific, thank you.
You mentioned about cul-de-sacs. Is that a state requirement that
Yes.
there won't be any more
It's in the
cul-de-sac?
government, well, it basically requires 2 means of access for anybody. If you look back in the maps that I sent to you, there's an analysis of where those are, et cetera, within the community. So basically, in a high fire hazard, if you're in one of the very high or high fire
Yeah.
hazard areas, that is state law, yes.
Okay, because we have a future track that is a lot of cul-de-sacs as of the present time.
If it's in a very high fire hazard area, they're going to need to modify their
It's
plan.
very high. Okay.
Nothing else? We'll move on. Okay, so that is we also have a component of hazards from waste that we generate. So, companies that have toxics, you think about medical supplies are technically hazardous waste from the medical practice, et cetera, from manufacturing processes, et cetera. So, again, this is something that has been in place for some time. There's nothing terribly new in this particular section, but that's for the long time. There have been indeed requirements as well as importance and recognizing the importance that we minimize hazardous waste. And once we actually, because you can't completely avoid hazardous waste, again, you're going to have medical supply, which are technically hazardous. You're going to have some of these things as well as how you manage the hazardous waste. What do you do with them? How do you then ensure that these do not impact anyone who lives within the community or businesses within the community, et cetera? So you will see a series of policies here about education to residents about what is hazardous and how you address those, if you will. If you have hazardous waste, where do you take it? People who are diabetic and who are using self-injection, et cetera, they need to know what to do with their needles. That's a hazardous waste. So the educational process is really important about that. Or same thing to businesses. Where do you take your sludge or whatever out of a manufacturing process and relocate it, et cetera? Third bullet is basically that you also want those businesses who are working with hazardous waste to be able to have a plan and incorporating measures to address it. One of my stories, and when I first traveled to China a number of years ago, the Chinese were very proud of taking you through the basically what we call the thermos factors, the factors where they would actually blow onto a pipe and create that thermos insert, et cetera. And they would have all of the glass bottles, not on racks or anything, just sitting on the floor at the side of the room. Potential disaster. Basically, it's basically requiring businesses, and we, in our building codes and our requirements, we'd have controls of that, where you basically organize these spaces so that you don't have exposure of these waste to the workers or to people who may be customers, et cetera. And maybe actually, Edward, this gets to a little bit, the fourth bullet is about coordinating emergency response to hazardous materials spills. Might tie a little bit into if that was the train incidents, et cetera. Prohibiting the use and transport of any of these wastes in proximity to schools and housing. Basically, you want to isolate those from our areas of sensitivity in terms of the community. Enforcing regulations, obviously, for how you control these schools. And also minimizing transportation also in, schools and parks. There's a little bit of redundancy in those two as well. Let me jump on to the third goal relative to, I'll leave it at that. Anything else, any comments on hazardous waste?
Have we talked about like CO2, like gases?
That's
anywhere?
in air quality, we'll be addressing air quality.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on to the goal about this is a little bit redundant with what we covered earlier in water, and so that's unfortunately the nature of some of the content requirements of these elements themselves about minimizing the threat of surface and groundwater contamination. These two, ultimately, we may combine these into one section at least, so that someone who is interested in water contamination doesn't have to look to two different places in the general plan. But it's basically the similar, a similar approach that what you're going to do in this case is more focus upon who you're working with. You're working with county and surrounding cities to protect surface water and groundwater from contamination. You're working with property owners to remediate existing sources of contamination, and you're going to have a water quality management plan, which is a normal requirement for development. Okay, no comments there. Flooding and dam inundation. There, again, the maps that were attached to the second submittal to you identify the flood zones and the dam inundation areas potentially impacting the city. And obviously for these, there will be certain development limitations. Under certain floodways, you cannot develop at all, or certain floodways, there are flood insurance issues as well. And so the policy, rather than what we have up here on the screen, is much more specific regarding what those limitations will be. Those are current requirements in terms of what the setbacks would be, as well as the limitations as well. Beyond limiting development in the areas of designated floodways, you're going to want to maintain the flood control systems to not impact the joining areas. The people who are doing that in the Central Valley with their levees are having fun these days, et cetera. That we think about not just, and actually this goes back to something you said about thinking about green infrastructure as incorporating to the extent as possible as a means of stormwater management, not everything having to be concrete. Now, obviously, the Army Corps always argues that you need the concrete to provide adequate flood control, but to the point where you can create green infrastructure as a means to control the flow, the volume of the flow, and also the spillage and the extent of the flow as an objective. And this also basically gives direction to the city, and this is out of your existing plan, to take a look at what is happening around you. Because if you, in the sphere of influence or these areas adjacent to the city, if you have flooding impacts or drainage impacts from there, that can impact you in the city. So basically the policy is to have that ability to review and provide comment on development proposals that are abutting you that may impact the floods or controls the storm drainage within the city of San Bernardino. Obviously having adequate capacity to handle the floods. You've got the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, and then obviously maintaining your hospitals, your police, fires, facilities, et cetera, during those events, and maintaining to the extent feasible the water courses and streams in a natural state. You have, besides the major river, you have obviously other areas of drainage, riparian corridors, and other kinds of areas that are natural drainage and stream areas that you want to maintain in a natural state as much as possible. So it's both an ecological as well as a flood protection hazard objective out of that. Any comments on this section? Policies, questions? Flooding, yes, but not the whole safety section yet. Okay. Soon. Okay. The next one, seismic and geologic hazards. We know what those are in the community. Obviously, going to continue to require investigations, particularly within near those fault zones, et cetera. Areas of geologic seismic risk, so any development proposal, city will require studies, maybe trenching or fault identification or analysis of the slope stability, et cetera. Obviously, Alquist-Priola Act requires restrictions on any development within the Alquist-Priola zone, which are for the two major, San Jacinto and the San Andreas. Somehow San Andreas, which are the San Andreas and the San Jacinto faults. And then obviously you have standards, and usually development standards for protection of development where you have liquefaction risks, landslide risks, seismic subsidence risks, et cetera. Liquefaction, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically flatland areas where it's a sandy soil that if you have high groundwater, that during an earthquake, it turns that, if you will, sand in that soil into soup, if you will, and you lose the foundation of buildings, and you can have a building collapse because of the liquefaction concerns. Obviously, you want to protect your police, fire, health facilities, retrofit of unreinforced masonry buildings. I don't know where the city stands on that today, but didn't get any comment on that being in here. But, most cities, and a lot of cities have still going through the process of requiring retrofit because not all the unreinforced masonry buildings have been retrofitted. There was an article, I think, recently in the LA Times indicated Southern California, there were a substantial number of buildings that had not been reinforced due to earthquake, as well as obviously earthquake preparedness in terms of the systems. We have our earthquake drills and other things that are out there as well. Any questions on seismic and geology? Okay, if not, moving on to a topic we heard from the audience, winds. Obviously, a policy recognizing that we are in a high wind area at the foothills, base of the foothills, and in this portion of San Bernardino County. And obviously, there are policies indeed how we locate, design development to protect from high wind events, which also requires adherence to building and fire codes, which also provide guidance and standards for how one must adhere to that. You also want to design buildings. Let's say you have multiple buildings on a site. Let's say we're downtown and we have 3 20-story buildings, 10-story buildings located to each other. The potential effects, wind funneling is how you position the buildings one to another to have the funneling between the buildings, and how the buildings, by put them too close, you can create a funnel that accelerates the velocity of the wind. You want to design your infrastructure to withstand extreme wind philosophies. This is often a big issue. We think about our power grid and our other things all the time of power lines going down and other infrastructure, and how those will be designed to do that. Obviously, cities not doing that, but you work with your entities that are providing the infrastructure, Edison or whomever else, to basically encourage them to do that. To the extent possible, undergrounding electrical transmission infrastructure. This has become a big issue in recent fire throughout the state of California, where, PG&E is the bad boy a lot up north because of what happened at Paradise and other places as well. And then obviously, if we're going to have wind events, we'll have power outages. It's kind of a given. But to provide backup medical supply for particularly those who have medical devices that actually require some kind of power to keep them both for refrigerating medication as well as for indeed treatment of the person if they're on a breathing machine or whatever else that those individuals are as well. Any questions about the wind policies? Okay, moving on to fire. Obviously,
I have one.
yeah.
I just thought of it.
Yeah, Angela.
We recently had a tornado in an area here in California that I was just floored. No alerts, no nothing. I see that we have probably no one designating those type of alerts here because it doesn't exist, but they should have something in that factor stating, just like we get kidnapping, seniors are gone, or dogs are lost, they should do something of that sort of nature. Otherwise, it's gonna be too late. We're not prepared. Just like the mountain, the snow, he made a very big factor. We are not prepared, and we need to start getting prepared. So we need to make sure that we emphasize in the event of this type of emergency, shoot it out there.
Yeah, and I think, again, this goes back to identifying, like you said before, one sort of entity or for these, because during this year, where I live, I've had at least 5 or 6 calls, alerts from Edison about potential power outages due to winds. There's a winds event. Their purpose is not any damage. They're dealing with wind, but they're trying to protect this. Be prepared for at least 4 to 5 hours of outage because of a wind event that we anticipate that may occur. Now, I'd say 90% of the times it never happened, but that one time or 2 times that it did happen, it obviously had consequences as well. So it's a similar kind of situation as getting that information and not necessarily relying upon Edison as being the person who's doing the alerting you as well.
I did find out recently that Edison is giving rebates for anyone that's purchasing any type of air compressors, they're generators.
Right.
Generators. So they're giving large rebates for those that have medical conditions or just need the power. And I do believe that we should all be doing solar in the event of an emergency of this sort of nature. It really helps out for those that are in need of oxygen or medical or kids or whatever.
Hence some of the policies back in the energy section where we talked about having the on-site storage facilities as well. Yep.
That's good. Thank you.
Fire hazard. I think we're getting close to all the hazards. We have one more after this. Fire hazards, you know what they are. And obviously, there's a lot of building codes, subdivision codes that have regulations and development standards relative to where you place buildings, building materials, et cetera. The fire codes in the state of California are getting more restrictive and severe, et cetera. We know what happened. We know it's not just being necessarily in an area where you are covered with trees. I saw the damage in Sonoma after the fire up there a couple of years, where the fire actually jumped the freeway into a residential tract subdivision that had no trees at all in it before. So fire embers, basically flying from the foothills into the areas of et cetera. So you will see again the requirements about the building construction, development, and management of fires through the vegetation, through fire retardant roofs and construction, brush removal, weed abatement, et cetera. Periodically looking at your building and fire codes to make sure that they are up to date and require adherence for new development, et cetera. Sometimes it's easy to get behind the scenes. These codes right now are changing fairly frequently because of our fire events in California. Requiring a fire plan for new development. So if you are that project up in, let's say that plan goes ahead, you were talking about the concern about the specific plan is requiring that development to have a fire safety plan specifically designed for that development, for the people who live in that development, et cetera. Maintaining police, fire, medical response to fire events. And then obviously you want adequate water supply. You want to make sure that the water supply is sufficient to meet the needs and protect and treat the fire and attack the fire once you have the fire. Any questions on these? Okay. A couple more on minimizing the impacts of fires. I'm sorry, there were a couple of others here on education. Again, as we've had education about other sort of hazards, is educating the public about, fire hazards and what to do in case of a fire hazard and emergency. And then obviously to have, once you have had a fire and you've had denuded landscape and the landscape has changed, is to have the landscape remediation after the fire has occurred, which also is important to prevent erosion and landslides and flooding we often see in the hillside areas, et cetera. Okay, then there are two, if you will, slides here about being resilient to adapt to climate change. Climate change, in many respects, reflect all of the other kind of hazards we talked about, many of the other hazards. But the first one of these is an experiencing we're having more of, and that's protection of the humans from heat events. I mean, this not only here in California, but just the last few years, the deaths in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Vancouver, and Seattle due to extreme heat in the summer. So the notion that we make sure that we have those opportunities to protect humans from these, especially those who are vulnerable from heat events, such as cooling centers, et cetera. Working with the health providers in the community that they have a response program for heat events, et cetera, which normally had not been considered a disaster. in the past, that you think about these large warehouse and logistics centers. One of the concerns is whether they provide adequate cooling for the workers in these big warehouse spaces, et cetera, and that we make sure that there is adequate climate control in these kinds of buildings. You want to make sure that where we have an extreme weather event, that we have the buildings that are designed to be resilient, and transit being resilient to these as well. We already talked about earlier water conservation and drought-tolerant landscapes as a component of a climate change program. And then obviously the last bullet is for encouraging development to incorporate and existing development to sustainable, energy efficient, environmentally regenerative facilities, landscapes, and structures. So basically saying we need to design our buildings and our sites and our landscapes to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. The first policy here under this is somewhat redundant with the earlier one about heat events, et cetera. So protection from heat events and working with health providers. I'm sorry, this is the same policy. I wanted to emphasize climate change so much. Got to get that covered. So any comments on this particular section? You got through it? Yes, there's a lot here, but I'm not sure of any that we could take out.
And we do have public comment, I believe.
And we have a public comment, I understand.
Well, I think we are in the general consensus to accept and file the recommendations as presented by Woody.
And we do have public comment, too.
Oh, do we still have public
For
comment?
for this specific item, yeah, we have Ryan,
Okay,
and then we have Jim, and that's it.
okay.
And again, remember, I also left open the opportunity for any, as you think about this over the next couple of weeks, the opportunity to provide additional comments over the next couple of weeks.
So with this, I just want to highlight the site of the Carousel Mall as a big point of interest as it's being developed. I think this, implementing all of these in that one project, of course across the city, but having that be a nice highlighted spot would be very good to just promote that across the city and say, hey, this is something we can point at that's a successful concept, and just spread that throughout. Thank you.
Okay. One more?
Speaking primarily of flooding and the seismic problems, San Bernardino City Hall is a prime example of how things can get out of hand. A study done many years ago when the groundwater table under the City Hall was very high resulted in a seismic study of City Hall saying that in the event of a major earthquake, because of the high groundwater table, City Hall could pancake and collapse down. We had a city manager who apparently didn't read that study very carefully and missed, it seems, that part of it, because that was the only earthquake threat to that building, primarily the only one, at least it was the major one, because the building was built with a sway factor. And having been in there for many years, when we had, every time there was an earthquake, we were on the top floor, we'd sway. Well, this city manager, I won't say he panicked, but he got very concerned on the 6th floor where his office was also, and the earthquakes, it was swaying, and a crack occurred in the council chambers, not unlike cracks that have occurred in buildings throughout the city. And he had a close professional friendship with a person who was advocating that we needed to be very, abandon all these buildings that were earthquake unsafe. And he read a study in the newspaper that scientists could now predict earthquakes. If you had a number of small earthquakes in an area, it might mean that there was going to be a big one soon, and that appeared in the sun. So he quickly had the building abandoned. Well, the problem was the groundwater table, since that study was done, had decreased significantly. So significantly that the long time for years chairman of the San Bernardino Municipal Water District stated that if it rained every day for a year or 2 or 3 years, the groundwater would not get back that high. So the building was abandoned for no real scientific problem. He hired an engineering firm to do some subsequent studies. The engineering firms was interested in getting the contract to retrofit City Hall, so of course they built that up. Completely lost was the fact that there had been a subsequent study which showed that City Hall was safer in an earthquake than any building that had been built in the downtown area since City Hall was built. And by the way, when the city left City Hall and they went to other privately owned cities, buildings in the city, guess who got the contract? The property management firm that had contributed substantially to a charter change that the then current administration wanted. Every building that was rented by the city to move the occupants of City Hall into were managed by that firm. So certainly it's important, but you gotta stay up with the data and check who's behind the scenes.
Karen?
Thank you, Karen Suarez, 7th Ward. I wanted to make a comment just about you use equity in some of the other areas, but on the safety one, like I didn't see it in the main paragraph, and I still think that's really important because Sierra Way is like a river during the flood season, and it's like this is an older neighborhood. Houses have been there for decades, and purposely the what is it called? The sidewalks are about like 1.5 feet tall, so we know that it floods. But with the last rains, I mean, it's just how much longer? So I just think prioritizing some of the neighborhoods where we've historically had these issues, because they're the first streets to get all messed up. They're the first streets to have a ton of flooding, and we've known about the issue. So I think like that equitable distribution of like where you're going to invest those resources, that's really important, especially as you look at infrastructure money that's coming down from the federal government. It's really important. Most of our neighborhoods qualify for this disadvantaged community funding. And so having that is really going to help us make a case to get those investments into San Bernardino. The other one was around the wind. I don't know if you have to make a reference to the trees, but there's a lot of really beautiful mature trees that unfortunately, like, they're going to fall real soon, and it causes a lot of harm for the neighborhood itself when those trees fall. And when the trees do fall, or even when we have to go in and cut them prematurely because we know that they're a hazard, if we could figure out a way to also replant, because we also want that positive, greening effect within our neighborhoods. We had a tree fall in my neighborhood. It never got replaced. Then they came and removed another tree and on the same block. So we've lost 2 mature trees in our neighborhood that were providing shade and were really beautiful. And I know that they also protect at some point when they're not so tall from the wind. But so that was another thing that I saw. But again, just really making the case for equity throughout this general plan, and even in every subsection. I don't think it's too much to ask to remember that, because that's how neighborhoods deteriorate, is when we leave them behind. Thank you.
Is there something on there for tree planting just in general for neighborhoods that don't have trees?
There should be, we'll figure, I mean, it's not this element, but it would be either land use or conservation. One of the two.
So in conservation, either to replace the trees that have fallen, and to look for areas where there were no trees planted, because there are neighborhoods that are barren of trees and so forth, and to have trees earmarked for those neighborhoods. Okay.
Yep.
Any more public statements? Any more questions from the panels? Then if we're a consensus, then we will accept and file the recommendations as presented. And we'll move on. Do we have any committee reports or announcements from the General Plan Advisory? I didn't think so. No. The director's report?
Just to reiterate what Woody already mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, that the land use map is available on the website, and just spread the word, and if you want to take a look at it yourselves, please do so. Also, just update on the housing element, we are anticipating, we as staff are anticipating a draft of the housing element this week from PlaceWorks. We will do an initial review, provide any initial comments to PlaceWorks for some revisions, and we hope to have that available publicly within a month. So just wanted to let you know that is moving forward. And then once it's available and out for review for a period, then we'll begin the public hearing process to sort of get the blessing from the Planning Commission and City Council before we submit it to the state for their review. So it is a long process on that, but it is because you've provided input onto that and heard presentation recently from Mark Hoffman. Just wanted to give you an update. Also, the downtown specific plan is also moving forward. We've reviewed a full draft of that document, provided comments to PlaceWorks, and we're awaiting revisions on that plan as well. And we'll hopefully be convening the downtown advisory committee soon, so we can go over that and making that document publicly available as well. So lots of things moving.
There being no further business before this committee, then we adjourn this meeting until April 17th